Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are now in day 77 of the ongoing war between the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and its NATO-backed allies. I first wanted to, before I get into kind of the meat and potatoes of what is happening on the ground, I first wanted to talk about a comment made by the British defense minister, and what he has said recently. I really have to discuss and call out, and it's really a kind of a rubbish statement that is really directed for the low information person who doesn't really understand, but has the ability to listen to what he says and take it with merits. And I'll just tell you what he said. So he claims, and this is a statement, NATO accounts for 6% of his land border. That's not being surrounded if only, and he says it again, 6% of your land border is NATO countries, the UK Defense Secretary said. All right. So, yes, 6% in theory, if that's what that number is, that sounds tremendously low. But they're playing with funny numbers here when they say that, and it really creates a false narrative, especially in terms when you try to look at it from the Russian perspective. So yes, if you look at NATO countries, if you look at the Baltics, Poland, Romania, the Slovak Republic, Hungary, and even then you can't really equate those countries because in theory they don't directly share a border with Russia. But obviously you do have Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Now, where these numbers get really funky is they're saying that, and they're looking at it from the perspective of all of the Russian Federation. So look, most of the Russian Federation borders uninhabited zones of the planet. Much of the border of Russia that runs from Finland up to Murmansk, all the way to Siberia, obviously, is not a concern. But the areas that are a concern from the Russian perspective, and you have to understand what's going on and what is occurring, you have to try to understand that component of the conflict. And by saying 6% is only the areas in which border that NATO's border is really obtuse. And I just yes, if that's the case, yes, then 6% would be a accurate a number. But the strategic viability of those lands that are within the context of the NATO alliance are incredibly important. It's the westward facing areas of the Russian Federation. Furthermore, you have to understand these states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, were at one point part of the Soviet Union, and obviously Poland was part of the Warsaw Bloc. So I think using that number, while not completely incorrect, it is still very, very inaccurate from in which he is trying to put it into context. And that's something that is being used and done by the British Defense Secretary, Mr. Wallace, to mislead the public. If you, the low information person, hear a news blurb on CNN, well, only 6% of of Russia is bordered by NATO. That's a talking point that you may expel at some point to other people you're talking with. But you have to look at it deeper than that and understand that number is very difficult to take with a grain of salt in terms of the size of the Russian Federation. Again, much of the area is that Russia controls is very much areas that simply don't border other nation states, that are Arctic-like conditions for much of the year, and to say that 6%, and that's what NATO controls, you're really missing the crux of the problem, especially in terms of the Russian perspective. And look, I'm not trying to take a side here. I'm just trying to say that what the British Defense Secretary is saying is really grossly misrepresenting much of the problem that Russia has, especially in its relationship with the continued growth of NATO. And now we're in all probability we'll see Finland join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So will we hear Ben Wallace then say that land areas that NATO control now has doubled or quadrupled with the introduction of Finland to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? I don't think you will hear that. I don't think you will hear that he will say that areas under the control or under the guardianship of NATO has just doubled with the inclusion of Finland. Don't think you'll hear that, but I find it very interesting that he did say, "Oh, it's just 6%," and it's much more complicated than that. And the areas in question are much of the what you would define as the European part of the Russian Federation. So really just an inaccurate statement that is designed to create a false narrative, and that really has to be pointed out. Other news: the U.S. House has passed Joe Biden's recommendation of $40 billion in defense aid to Ukraine. So $40 billion. Let's look at that for a second. So what does $40 billion get you in terms of defense spending when you compare and contrast maybe some other nation states? Well, $40 billion gets you the defense budget for an entire year for Poland and Israel combined. So Israel, very, very powerful military, as is Poland, very robust member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And both of those defense budgets now would equal the $40 billion that is being supplied to Ukraine to continue to assist in this new Lend-Lease efforts to help Ukraine fight against the Russian Federation. And obviously, big number. United States is in tremendous amounts of debts. Just saw an article in which in the state of Maryland there are mothers in the U.S. state of Maryland who are unable to find a baby formula in the stores. So $40 billion to Ukraine. Priorities. So in the ongoing conflict, obviously it still continues. There's been new reports that have come out of U.S. intel agencies that indicate that the Kremlin, the Russian leadership, is definitely looking at the long haul and intend to continue to fight this conflict until they perceive they have quite possibly achieved a victory. Now, what is that victory? It's difficult to say at this point. I stand by my contention that victory for Russia in terms of war aims and war goals would be nothing less than all lands east of the Dnieper River. And I continue to stand by that, and I think if the Kremlin were to end the war at this point, in terms of what we're looking at right now in terms of territory held, and quite honestly, I don't think the Ukrainians would cease fighting with even these territories under Russian control, and they would continue probably in all likelihood to fight. But as I talked about the strategic situation for Russia, it really places them in a precarious situation in terms of if the Ukrainians rearm, and we fully believe that will occur. There's talk now that the magnitude to rebuild Ukraine, and a lot of that money obviously is going to come from the West, is in the area of anywhere from $500 billion to $600 billion, and as the war continues, possibly up to $1 trillion. So, is that in the cards for the United States to help rebuild Ukraine after this conflict? Difficult to say at this point, but the war continues. The Russians continue to push its operations with the intent of eventually circumventing and encircling key cities and towns such as Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Severodonetsk. The Ukrainians right now have a fairly robust defensive operation underway. Right now, they roughly have 3 lines of defense extending from Izium all the way down towards Donetsk. And obviously, you have the first that is directed along the line of contact. The second line extends roughly from Bakhmut. That's this location. And one other important note, the Ukrainians continue to use the strategy of these fortress cities. We saw that in the First World War with the Soviet Union, turning cities into these fortified areas that they were willing to fight over. And in this case, it's probably going to lead to fairly extensive civilian casualties if those civilians are not evacuated from some of these cities that are indeed becoming fortress cities. So we know that towns like Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and now Bakhmut is becoming these so-called fortress cities, much like we saw in the fighting in and around and continues in Mariupol, and that fight over that metallurgical plant, that fortified area that the Ukrainians continue to resist from, continues. The Russians have up-tempoed its operations near Mariupol towards the metallurgical plant. But that's the case in point in terms of what we're seeing by the Ukrainians in terms of its defensive strategy. So even if the Russians are able to encircle and get Severodonetsk to capitulate, we do know, as I talked about in previous videos, the Russians are pulling back forces and relocating some of those forces to their second line of defense, which runs roughly in an area in this kind of this horseshoe type distance around Bakhmut, and then finally the main area of resistance, the final fallback line for the Ukrainians, is going to be an area within the vicinity of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. So again, hopefully that made sense. Three defensive lines by the Ukrainians within what could become the Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Bakhmut pocket if the Russians eventually achieve some sort of breakthrough near Izium, and then obviously to the southwest of Donetsk as well. That operation is going very slowly, quite possibly with, as we talked about before, that is the intent of Russian forces due to the casualties that the Russians sustained and occurred in areas such as the fighting that occurred near Kiev, northwest of Kiev, northeast of Kiev. The Russians are no longer attempting major maneuver operations. Again, they're just coming in with a lot of artillery, shelling the living hell out of an objective, and then they start to maneuver towards it and take it over with infantry and armored vehicles. So I think a lot of folks watching this conflict was anticipating that we would see some sort of Russian buildup in this major maneuver operation that would eventually encircle Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. You got to remember, we observed at one point there was about 50 to 60,000 Russian forces that were extending inside of Belarus, just to the west of Kiev, and extending all the way to the east towards Sumy. And those 50,000 forces, some are still present, but many of those forces, especially the forces that were assigned to Belarus, those VDV formations, have since been redeployed to Belgorod. Now, at the same time, ironically, we are seeing a Ukrainian offensive operation within the vicinity of Kharkiv. We now know that Ukrainian forces have pressed all the way now to the shared border between Russia and Ukraine, and that fighting continues as the Ukrainians continue to press operations. We understand some of these operations within the last 24 hours may have decreased in some areas in terms of tempo. The Russians continue to resist and counter this operation with attack helicopters, tactical fixed-wing aircraft, and lots of heavy artillery. We believe at this point there are roughly 19 Russian battalion tactical groups within the area of Belgorod and the area of the general offensive, counteroffensive by the Ukrainian forces that will eventually be brought to bear. And quite possibly, at some point, the Russians could be looking at launching a counter-operation. We would suspect that would take place to the west of Kharkiv and to the west of Belgorod, probably in this general vicinity, if, in fact, it does occur. The Russians could be in a situation where they're simply looking to hold the battlefield in place, and that may be the actual shared Ukrainian-Russian border in this ongoing Ukrainian operation, with the intent of eventually continuing its operations in the southeast with the goal of seizing Severodonetsk, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and some of these other what are quickly becoming fortress cities. The Ukrainians continue to mobilize, deploy, and strengthen its forces in this area, making it really a tough nut to crack for the Russian forces. But if U.S. intel is believed to be correct in some of the intelligence information, it does appear that Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership do in fact intend to fight this for the long haul, and quite possibly. I don't believe that, at least as I just talked about, that the Kremlin insiders, those key individuals in leadership positions, would see victory anything less than seizing all areas east of the Dnieper River, and that would kind of create that strategic depth that the Russians are looking for. I think ideally they would like all of Ukraine, but the force construct that is being utilized right now is just not big enough to achieve that goal. And if the Russians wanted to do that, we would have to see a full national mobilization for that to happen. And we're just not really seeing that. We are seeing more of a clandestine, covert mobilization and expansion of Russian forces that obviously have those more limited war goals and war aims in mind. And in all likelihood, the Russians will continue to prosecute the conflict until those war goals or war aims are in fact met. But that's all we have for today. Thanks for joining us, and we'll have more very, very soon.